come to believe that one's perception is dominated by what I call one's original landscape. And let me explain that. I think your original landscape is the visual or physical environment that you were in during your forming years. That is your early years. I think that would differ for different people in terms of their pace of development. In my case, my forming years were spent at the foot of Table Mountain. Our dining room had a beautiful view of the mountain, and every morning my father would indicate another aspect or color or cloud formation of this beautiful mountain. It's really a very imposing piece of rock, and it has different cloud formations falling over it all the time, which is called the tablecloth of course, Table Mountain. So that's a very important image to me, that sense of omnipotence of the mountain in Cape Town, whichever side of it you live. And of course, all the different coasts of the sea, because Cape Town is both set on the Indian and the Atlantic Ocean. And to me, that kind of rock space and this link to the sea in my imagination has a very important role. Then the other second most important original landscape takes place in the interior of the country in two different places. First of all, in what used to be called Bechuanaland, and where the former Boer republics Stellaland and Goosen used to be, and what is today partly Botswana and partly the so-called homeland of Bophuthatswana. And this used to be the father of the farm of my paternal grandparents, a farm called Langverwag, which means long awaited, literally translated. And this is a farm my grandparents moved to by ox wagon from Wolmaranstad, a village in the Western Transvaal in South Africa. And my mother told me about this trek when my grandfather finally went and bought this farm, how they trekked through the countryside by ox wagon, and they would stop and do what you call uitspan, that is to take the oxes off the wagon and let them wander and graze. And the roads were really just like tracks in the sand and going through the bushes. And my grandmother would have everything inside the wagon, her kitchen, clothes, bedding, everything. It was literally a home on wheels. And she would make food. You know, they used to eat something called mieliepap, which South Africans still eat a lot, independent of their cultural adherence. But they would make this very stiff porridge from maize meal and have meat with it. And my grandmother would make my mother sit with her legs on either side of the sort of rift in the middle, running through the middle of the two tracks, and she would have a little bowl of food, and that's how she would eat. And I spent a lot of my time of my childhood on this farm, and I remember one specific incident which marked me a lot and certainly remained very clear in my memory. As children, we were asked, or not really asked or forbidden, but it was kind of indicated that we shouldn't really play with the little black children, that is the workers' children on the farm. And around my grandmother's house, there used to be a yard with a fence around it, with always a lemon tree in the yard. And one day I found myself playing with little polished tin cars, so to say. We used the tins as cars, and we used to make roads in the mud and make the mud really hard with water and play around with our cars and make bridges and clover intersections, etc. And suddenly the shadow appeared between the two of us, that is myself and Anna, the woman who worked as a domestic in my grandmother's house, in the sand. And I looked up, and there was this ominous figure of my grandmother standing above us, looking at us from the veranda with her hands in her hips and screaming, "Come inside." And the next thing I saw, Anna's child turning on his heels and getting fumbled in the gate. He was so nervous he couldn't open the gate, and taking the la piste, the track, out to the struis, which is what their houses are called. These are really like mud huts with a mud wall around them and a mud floor as a courtyard. Running out there, and on his way to the struis, which we could just about see from the main house, he ran through a field where there were cattle grazing, and one of the young bulls came towards him and headed for him. And it was so wonderful. I was standing just for a flash of a moment. I mean, this all happened very, very quickly. I was standing there watching him and seeing how skillful he was in getting out of the situation. I mean, this young bull, a really hefty Jersey bull, charging at him. And all he did was he put his hand on his forehead, on the bull's forehead like that, and it stopped dead in his tracks. He sidestepped and he ran off to the struis, that is to the hut. And the next thing I turned around, and my grandmother was still standing there staring at me with her eyes. She used to wear glasses and look very sort of threatening. And a few steps from her, there was Anna, the little boy's mother, standing ironing on the veranda, or the stoep, as we call it in Afrikaans. She was ironing with irons, that you warm up on the coal stove and then take out and quickly iron until they get cold and warm up another one. And of course, she must have been very, very hurt by all of this. And my grandmother promptly called me inside. And as I walked inside, I saw Anna jumping off the veranda onto the sand and grabbing the two polished tins and putting it in between her breast, in her cleavage. We were about to have lunch at that point. I still remember it very clearly. It was green bean and lamb stew with pieces of potato in it. And we used to eat that with raw onion and chutney. And we sat down at lunch table, and of course, each meal in true Calvinist tradition was started and ended with a prayer, which goes something like this: Zeg Vader, geen we eten, laat ons nimmer u vergeten, Amen, which is something like, say, Father, give us food, let us never forget you, Amen. No sooner had we started the meal, oh yes, on that specific day, we also had vetkoek, which is like a kind of donut type cake, which is fried in oil, like a big round dough cake fried in oil. We also had those. No sooner had we started that my grandmother turned with great authority to my mother and, ignoring me totally, said to her, "You must tell the child not to play with those children. They're dirty. She can get diseases." And my mother didn't say anything to me, but I remember that night, that evening at sunset, I went for a walk with my mother in the mealie fields. I mean, it's really very beautiful, that area. It's totally flat, and here and there you have the odd, what we call doringboom, a thorn tree, which is a very sparse tree. It's a kind of acacia with tiny little leaves and the most beautiful yellow butterflowers. And you have this sparse landscape with burnt yellow mealie fields, because this was in winter. It was almost the reaping time. And we were walking through the fields, and the workers were coming back from the fields, drawn by a cart and donkeys. And as they drove past, Johannes, this is now Anna's husband, used to call the donkeys names, and he was to drive and whip them and call, "Salpeter, Blauster, the rooi paard, come on, come on." And it was like his voice became part of the whole landscape. It was like an audiovisual landscape in a way, and you'd see the sun setting on the very, very flat horizon, and some parts of it shining through these very austere, stark trees. And my mother and I were walking, and suddenly she put her arm around my shoulders and she said, you know, you're a very pretty little girl, and you should really take care and not play with the little boys. And, you know, the blacks out here in the countryside, they're wild. They're not used to being so close to white people. And especially since you're a little girl, you should really take care. And I remember not really understanding. It's not because I was so innocent that I didn't understand the danger. I was certainly innocent, but I think one understands those things without them needing to be spelled out to you. Another thing I remember very clearly from that farm, Langverwach, was each year my father was asked by my grandmother to kill a young calf. And my father was really not the hunting type. He just didn't have that kind of violence or that hunting spirit in him. And it was always very, very traumatic for him. And I remember on the day of slaughter, he would not speak from the morning. He would become very tense and introvert and quiet. And around 2 o'clock, when he had to take the rifle and walk out and actually go and shoot the beast that had been tied to a pole for the past few days so that it wouldn't move, so that it would eat a lot and gain weight, etc., etc. We all had to be inside. We didn't have the right to go outside and watch. And one day, my mother and grandmother allowed my sister and I to look through the window. And here we were. I remember it was like, you know, French windows with wooden frames, so it's tiny square frames. And there was like the three generation of women. My grandmother, this austere woman whose husband, after being an invalid for 12 years, died. And she continued farming in this deserted spot in Bechuanaland on her own, and she had become very austere in her manner. So there she was behind us, and in front of her, slightly below my mother, and further down, my sister and I, looking through the window, watching my father, this solitary, sensitive man walking with a rifle in his hand, scared that he won't hit the calf between its eyes immediately, and that he would wound the animal and make it suffer. And you could see the concentration on his face as he leant the point of the rifle on the fence and aimed at it. And on this day, as he leant it on the rifle, he was about to trigger off when it was as if he sensed that we were watching him, and he turned around and he looked, and I could see that he could see us, and he was terribly perturbed. Anyway, he fired and he hit the animal right here between the eyes, and it kind of staggered on its feet and fell over. And no sooner had it collapsed that Johannes and a few other workers came along and took it by its legs and tried to keep it still. But, you know, an animal like that kicks for quite a while, and Johannes took an enormous shiny knife from his pocket and slit the animal's throat. And you saw blood like pouring out, and dogs and chickens and anything that was alive and not human rushed to the scene to try and pick up the blood as it rushed into that sort of golden yellow semi-desert sand. And within the next 20 minutes, they pulled off the skin and took out the stomach, cleared it from its contents, hung that over the fence, and started slaughtering the animal. And an hour later, its different pieces were hanging in different thorn trees around the yard, drying in the wind, salted before it was either being taken to a cold room where it would be stored, or salted and coriander and spices put onto it and dried in a cool, dry room to become what we call biltong, which is a kind of dry meat, and it's a delicatessen in South Africa. In fact, there's a butcher, a South African butcher in New York who makes the stuff, also dried sausages. And he has, I think it's the 800 number that you can call free. And you can get this wonderful biltong even in New York, and in London the other day I saw it as well. Then The other place that made a tremendous impression on me is my paternal grandparents' farm, called Sherman. And this farm is situated in the Kalahari, somewhere between Uppington, Kuruman, and Olifantshoek. The Kalahari is different. It's more hilly, and the hills have rock formations like iron rock, red rock formations, also with a lot of thorn trees. Um, to me, it's a more beautiful landscape, and to me, that's the heart of the country, and that's really for me where I come from. That's where my soul was formed. Um, there's the most beautiful spot in the Kalahari on that farm, on the Shermaning farm. It's called the Paniki. It's a kind of small lake, I suppose one could say, surrounded by the most beautiful variation of trees, willows, acacias, different bushes, and it's like a walled up dam that only has water when it's rained. You know, in these areas, when it rains, you have a tremendous storm and a tremendous downpour of water, and it all runs away, and some of it runs into this paniki, and some of it goes away, just runs away. And one day I went there on my own, which was really quite daring for me, being a city child, to whom landscape has only meaning as a city child. Landscape, I would like to just add here, is a city word. Landscape really means the way city or urban people or the urban mentality looks at what happens outside of it. And in ancient Greek, for example, the word landscape doesn't exist. What they have is a word for road or for track, going somewhere. In other words, crossing a landscape. So here I was, myself and my fox terrier dog, trotting off through this track to the Paniki, which is about 4 or 5 kilometers from my grandparents' house. And I arrived there, and it was one of the most exciting moments I had in my life, because as you walk through the trees, nothing grows on the ground because there's too much shadow. So you walk in amongst these trees, and it's like a very dark green, musky light, and the surface of the ground is covered by must. And at this point, the paniki was totally empty, and the surface of it was it was like these big cracks with cattle footprints in it. And I remember at one point in time, I stopped and I noticed right ahead of me was this deer standing there called a grysbokkie, a grey deer, a tiny, delicate little thing with tiny paws, and it stood like within, I don't know, a meter or two away from me. And this is a totally freak situation because these animals have a very keen sense of hearing. And it just stood there absolutely petrified. And I looked at it and it looked at me. And the minute I moved, in a flash, it had disappeared and it was totally gone. It totally disappeared. Another anecdote of this same farm, which I'd like to tell you about, is very often always the men going out and doing interesting things. But one day we were allowed, my sister and I, to go with my brother, my father, and my grandfather in his jeepy. We went to go and look at the springbok. And there's this plain called the Springbok Vlakte, the plain of the springbok. And beyond it, there's a small mountain range where my grandfather had a baboon cage set up, a baboon trap, because the baboons would come down from the hills and rip apart the little lambs and anything they could set their hands on, not to eat it because they don't eat meat, but just to play around and have fun. So they'd sit out there and watch the lambs and then come down, rip them apart and run off back into the hills. And my grandfather had this trap built, which is really a big square cage separated into 4 with trap doors attached of which the string is attached to a stone, and under the stone is a prickly pear leaf, like a big green cactus leaf. And the baboons just loved this. So they would come down from the hills into this cage and lift up the stone to get hold of the leaf, and that would release the string that would let the trapdoor fall. And every 2 or 3 days, my grandfather would go out there with his .22 rifle and go and shoot these animals. So on this day, this is what we were going to do as well. We arrived there. My grandfather asked my sister and I to stay in the Jeep and not look. But of course, the moment was so strong, we just got out of the car, out of the Jeep, and followed them. And what we hadn't realized that in this particular case, in the one of the cages was captured a mother, and in the other, this mother's little baby. And my grandfather noticed this because obviously he knows nature, he knows the animals very well, and he noticed that, and he decided to kill the mother first. So he pointed at her, promptly killed her. But as a child, I assisted at these things so often that I became used to it. That's why I often also say that life in Paris is not real. It's not authentic. It doesn't have that. Even if you go to the countryside, the life in the countryside is not really linked to a real chain. Whereas here, it was really necessary to kill these animals. And once you understand the chain and the necessity of it, you realize that there's nothing barbaric or savage about it. Anyway, so he shot the mother, and no sooner had she collapsed, of course, next to the fence separating her from the cage in which she was, from the cage that her baby was in, the baby rushed over, and he took her breasts and started pulling and pulping her breast, and actually pulled her breast towards her through the fence and started sucking on it frenetically in what I suppose was a last desperate act of reviving her. And the next thing, my grandfather aimed at the baby and shot him, and then called to Bobby, who was this half Bushman or Khoisan, to use the anthropological term, half Griqua man who served as a scout on the farm for my grandfather. He would always be seated on the bonnet of the GP and would push away the thorn trees and indicate the track to us where we had to go. He called to Bobby to tell him to put the baboons in the back of the GP, and we drove back. And I remember on the way back, I asked my grandfather, why do you shoot the baboons? And his answer to me was, obviously, he explained to me then that because they killed the little lambs, my child. And then on that day, it was a rather long expedition. We went and we stopped at another dam. This was now not like Paniki, this was a real dam. And I realized that my father and grandfather had brought their pistols with them, and that they were going to do a bit of sharpshooting. And on the wall of this dam, they had already set up a pole on which they would balance these bottles. And my sister and I were once again asked to remain aside, to keep our distance from this exercise. And I remember that day, as I was watching them, they became like cartoon figures. Suddenly they were no longer dressed in their casual khaki farm clothes, but they became dressed in like mafiosi type black, very slick black suits, and their hair became like black hair combed back over their heads with Brill cream or whatever product they would use. And they would aim, the bottles suddenly became little baboons or little men, and they would aim at these little men and they would shoot them, and they would fall off the pole and scramble around on the ground and rush up back the pole, and they would shoot them on and off again. And I remember the sound of the pistols as they went off. They would really reverberate right throughout this landscape. And it's really, on each occasion, almost, it's the sound giving the depth to the landscape, because the pistol would go off and it would go boom, and you'd hear it going right throughout the plain, and you could almost get a sense of any animal or anything that hears it, becoming very alert and raising its ears. It's the same with that little deer that I met at the Paniki, when it ran away, its steps actually gave me a sense of mystery of the space. So those are the landscapes that really remain with me and that influence every landscape I look at. When I first came to France, I would take a train sometimes to go to festivals or wherever out of Paris, and I would sit in the train and look through the window at these landscapes and actually say to myself that I don't understand these landscapes. I can recognize that there are mountains, there are plains, there are all the formations you have in South Africa, but they lack that authenticity, that wildness, that openness, that vibration that the landscape in South Africa have. And the organization, the agricultural organization, is different. Not a centimeter is left unattended. There are all these cute, neat, tidily built little walls and little tracks, and there's no just tracking with a jeep or a four-wheel drive throughout the bush and getting the smells when you crack the trees. And very often when I'd look at these landscapes through the windows of the trains, I would see the landscape, realize that I don't really understand it. My imagination would then superimpose a similar landscape over it, and I'd see my own reflection in the landscape. So it would be a kind of a way of seeing my old self and my new self through the old and the new landscape. Of course, now it's changed. I've become used to the French landscape, even though I haven't seen much of it. I tend to leave Paris and go to another continent rather than going into the French countryside. But even in terms of Paris, you don't have that sense of I don't know, almost a threat that can happen in other lands, in other cities. For example, in South Africa, you can have that vibrant blue sky vibrating against the red of the soil one day, and the very next day you can have a steel and glass tower signed by Helmut Jahn in its place. And one always has that sense of anything is possible and anything can happen. You can construct from zero. You can really invent. Whereas in Europe, the context, the historical context is so strong and determines so much of controls people's imaginations to such an extent that you can ever only hope to be original in the sense that you can come up with a new combination of known elements. And then, of course, there's my first souvenir, which is also an image or a landscape, even though I think a souvenir dating from the age of 3 months really has to be a reconstructed souvenir, because it's very unlikely that one has a real memory of something happening at such an early age. But this is really a visual image which comes back to me very often when I see things, and it's certainly for me one of the most important references I have in looking at things. I was 3 months old one Monday morning, and Monday in our household was wasdag, as we say in Afrikaans, washing day. And mother would always be in an extremely bad mood because she hated getting involved in all of this. It was a massive organization, setting up machines, getting them to wash, setting up others, getting them to rinse, getting the servants to wash, clean, iron, hang up the washing, see that they don't stay out there too long. And she was always in a very, very bad mood. And when she was in a bad mood, obviously for me, that meant less attention and exclusion. And on this very day, I remember her carrying me into her and my father's bedroom and plonking me down in the middle of their vast bed, covered by the most beautiful black cloth with enormous pink roses on it, of the same design than the curtains, pulling the curtains so that the room became almost dark, and just left me there. And I remember lying there and really feeling totally lost, as if I was in the middle of an island, and as if I was like a tortoise placed on my back and couldn't move. So I was lying there on this big bed and kicking into the air, trying to get away from it. trying to move and trying to get out of this helpless situation when my mother came into the room with a stack of my father's shirts hanging over her arm, and she just glanced at me very quickly, obviously not wanting to make eye contact because she knew what that would mean. She knew that I'd be calling her. But of course she did it, and I started screaming immediately, and she flatly ignored me, went to the cupboard, hung up the shirts, stopped for a moment at the foot of the bed, turned to me and looked at me. And at that moment I looked at her, and of course a child of that age, I think, has a very direct and physical link. And the only thing I could see were her two massive breasts, which I promptly undressed with my eyes. And from then onwards, all I could see were these two enormous milk white breasts turning away from me and bouncing out of the room. And needless to say, I was abandoned and devastated at that point. I screamed and kicked in the air again. And then the petals of the roses started lifting from the background of the fabric covering the bed. And these petals would fold backwards and forwards, and sometimes they would fold over me, and sometimes they would fold backwards. And going into this imaginary world of these roses, these enormous pink roses, almost turning into man-eating flowers, almost falling over me and devouring me completely, and falling back and letting me free into the real world, facing that exclusion that I felt from my mother. And until she came back, which is after a time, I don't remember how long, I just stayed there oscillating between having that sense of exclusion and being totally enveloped by these soft, moist pink petals, which was one of the most wonderful sensations I had ever experienced.